Yo, what's going on YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we are going to go over the latest heading into the trade deadline on the Vancouver Canucks. The Canucks are probably going to be one of the busier teams at the trade deadline. Maybe not making the seismic moves that we're talking about, but the fact we're talking about some of the changes that could come to Vancouver, we obviously have to talk about that. So we're going to be looking at that today. So we have a couple of guys to go over today. Some of the names are rental defensemen that nobody really cares about. And then there's also some rumors around the bigger guys, and specifically coming from the fans of the organization. Take with that what you will, but we're going to even talk about guys like Elias Pettersson here. So let's start off with some of the smaller guys. And that's no discredit to a player like Luke Schenn, who just won 2 Stanley Cups with the Tampa Bay Lightning in the past 2 seasons, so that's not talking too lightly. Luke Schenn has actually put together a quietly impressive season in Vancouver. He's done well in Vancouver in the past, decided last summer to make the leap, going to Vancouver again, and has put together a pretty solid campaign. He's probably going to go for probably what we expect to be a second and a pretty decent depth draft pick. And it sounds like there's a couple of teams interested in him. A gritty defenseman, has some NHL experience, obviously brings that cup pedigree, which he has recently been a part of. And he's got some skin in the game. And you look at, this is from Rick Dhaliwal, who is obviously a big part of the Canucks. Some believe that the Maple Leafs may have a trade interest in Luke Schenn. Now, there is some questioning about the Leafs in particular, because the Leafs have just made a trade with the Arizona Coyotes, which I'm sure some of you guys know. You may be wondering, what does this have to do with the Canucks? Well, unfortunately for the Canucks, if they want to make a deal with the Leafs, they may be less incentivized, as the Leafs sent Nick Ritchie, and I don't remember who else was in that deal, but Ilya Lyubushkin, who has one of the best names in the NHL. The Coyotes sent Ilya Lyubushkin to the Toronto Maple Leafs, which Lyubushkin brings that kind of game that Luke Schenn would have brought to the Leafs. So I don't necessarily know how, unless the Leafs just really like Luke Schenn in particular, that kind of defenseman, unfortunately, the Toronto Maple Leafs have already acquired. So I don't necessarily know how big that is. That's really the most we've had so far on Luke Schenn. But if you're looking for a team buyer in particular that's a playoff team, looking to add some sandpaper, grit, a veteran defenseman, brings the cup experience, a guy like Luke Schenn will definitely be in those same conversations. The teams that are looking at Ben Chiarot, the same teams that are looking at Big Gio, Mark Giordano, those kind of teams. The teams that are in on those guys, they're also going to look probably at Luke Schenn. Now, this is where things get a little bit more, we get more to the meat and potatoes of today's video on the Canucks, and that is the discussion around JT Miller and specifically Brock Boeser. So what's interesting with JT Miller, the front has completely changed. It was pretty much, JT Miller was like ready to get traded, and it sounded like there was some locker room issues, some chemistry issues, a divide in the Canucks locker room, and now Bruce Boudreau has come in. And it seems like that dynamic has sort of changed. I think Bruce Boudreau has kind of, maybe not completely fixed the locker room, but has given a little bit of authority to the point where maybe we're not seeing that separation like we had. And this is the first report from Rick Dhaliwal again. Gauged through industry sources that what JT Miller could ask for in a new contract, getting the feeling of around 5 to 6 years, well over $7 million AAV as a unrestricted free agent, or a UFA. Canucks reached out to Brock Boeser's agent this week, and are very early in the process. Again, that's from the Donnie and Dolly. They do a radio segment where obviously they talk a lot about the Canucks. And what's interesting here with JT Miller and Brock Boeser, they're both going to be needing new contracts this year. And there's obviously a different dynamic. JT Miller, a little bit older, will be an unrestricted free agency. So there's really no ties to the Canucks, which, as the Canucks currently sitting right now in the bottom 10 of the NHL standings, there's no real need for them to keep JT Miller past the trade deadline. They more than likely will trade him. It's just a question of if they get him extended before then. That's the only real thought here. If they sign him before the deadline, great. If not, you don't have a contract done, there's no reason for the Canucks to keep him. So this is from Pierre LeBrun, continuing on the JT Miller stuff. Canucks' message to other teams on JT Miller is very clear. You have got to step up in a meaningful way to get their attention, or else they're happy to keep him. Now, based off of what I just said, right? They're a non-playoff team. This is not an old player, but I think he's in his prime right now. What, 27, 28, 29 years old? Around late 20s, maybe even early 30s. I don't remember his exact age, but JT Miller, again, as an unrestricted free agent, it would be quite mind-boggling for the Canucks to keep him past the deadline, unless they were at least, I would say, 90% certain, if not more than that, certain that JT Miller would be returning next season. I understand he has been very good for them this season. He's probably going to be in the Hart Trophy conversation. As crazy as that sounds, he has been that good. And I think JT Miller, you got to give some credit where it's due, but you do not want to have a situation, as an Islander fan, I can tell you, it's not to the same degree, but when the Islanders kept John Tavares past the trade deadline, you knew they were getting themselves into trouble, and they were kind of tying themselves up and throwing them into the ocean. And you didn't have to do that. And I think that's something that you're seeing right now with JT Miller. Don't force the issue, but also don't just think he's going to re-sign at the end of the season. He's going to have the leverage at that point. He's going to talk to other teams. And you may have just lost your ticket on a guy that you could have gotten some real good value for at the deadline. It would be a real bad way to start off this Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford regime in Vancouver. And then that gets us into the Brock Boeser talk. And I think because they saw the market for Brock Boeser, a lot of the teams that are interested in a scoring winger have started to go in the direction of Brock Boeser. So this from Rick Dhaliwal. There are the rumors that are out there for the Canucks: JT Miller, Brock Boeser, Connor Garland, Tyler Mott, Luke Schenn, Jason Dickinson, Tucker Pullman, Tanner Pearson, Yaroslav Halak. But Halak's not going to happen. He's not going to waive his no movement clause, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this leads us into Brock Boeser, because Brock Boeser is probably the guy that for the last 2 weeks has gained more attention in media in terms of a trade rumor than JT Miller. And this is from Frank Saravelli. In the past 3 to 4 days, there's been more talk about Brock Boeser than JT Miller. Now, I do want to preface, this was like a week ago when this report came out, but I think it's interesting that now all of a sudden the dynamic has shifted. I think a lot of teams called on JT Miller, and they probably were like, no, we're not going to give that price for a pending free agent. Unless it is a sign-in trade, I think a lot of teams are just going to look elsewhere other than JT Miller. And that's why you're seeing the Canucks kind of play the game, well, we'll keep him, well, maybe not. They're just trying to get some leverage in a trade because, quite frankly, they know they have no leverage. So, again, that's where that's going to come into the equation. And more talks here about Boeser. This is, again, from Frank Saravelli. Talks have really picked up on a potential Brock Boeser trade for the Canucks. Continuing that, the Devils were well down the path of trading for Brock Boeser in the past. And this is all from Frank Saravelli. So that creates a definitely an interesting dynamic. And we've also heard that maybe Pavel Zacha would be a interest of the Vancouver Canucks. The Vancouver Canucks are kind of, kicking tires on the Devils forward. Could we see that as part of a package deal for Brock Boeser? Just something to keep an eye on. So again, the thing with Brock Boeser is, I think, 24, 25 years old. He's going to look for a bigger contract, and he's earned that at this point. I could see him looking for maybe a 5-year deal to take him till he's 30, and that way he could cash in his chips at the casino one more time, toward the end of his prime, hopefully with a couple of playoff runs in the mix there, till that contract that takes him till his mid to late 30s, and he could call it a day in the NHL, and that's it. So that's, again, the ideal situation, but I think Boeser's going to go down that route. The question is, do the Canucks want to fork up the money? There's, unfortunately, they're giving a lot of money right now to guys like Oliver Ekman-Larsson. It's eating away at their cap, so they don't have the money here. If they're really sold on Boeser, somebody else is going to have to move out. Whether that's JT Miller, they can't keep everybody. Whether that's Horvat, for that matter. And we'll get to that. So now we're going back to to Rick Dhaliwal, a lot of teams are calling on Niels Höglander, but the Canucks aren't shopping him. Now, keyword there, they aren't shopping him, but they're taking calls on Höglander. So just take with that what you will. If the offer, listen, it's one of those things, what's the saying? Everybody has a price. So, to be honest, if somebody gave, Mitch Marner, Austin Matthews, and maybe not John Tavares, but you get what I'm saying. You give up Morgan Riley for Elias Pettersson. I think the Canucks would consider giving up Pettersson in that deal, right? So it's part of that thing where it's not that they're untradeable until the deal is out there. So that's something where guys like Niels Höglander come in, that a young guy, they probably shouldn't be trading him. Quite honestly, they should be going more in that direction, going for guys on their entry-level contracts, guys that aren't getting paid a ton of money. And that way you could create some depth in your organization. So then when you have the JT Millers, when you have the Brock Boesers, that may not be sticking around once they want their $6-7 million per year, that's where Niels Höglander comes in. That's where Vasily Podkolzin comes into the picture and allows you to kind of retool on the fly, if that makes sense. And that way you keep your prospects that are already developed playing in the NHL. They're just going to get more minutes, right? So that's my thoughts on that situation with the Canucks. I think a lot of those guys that I mentioned earlier, like Mott, like Schenn, those guys will be gone by the deadline, and they might still go for a pretty good price. Like I said, they've all played fairly well this season. Now, this is where things get a little interesting. Jake DeBrusk is the latest guy in the mix here for the Canucks. So this is from Jimmy Murphy. The Vancouver Canucks reportedly have interest in Bruins forward Jake DeBrusk. Now, automatically, I'm thinking big picture here. Like, we're going to see a bigger trade, because if the Bruins want Jake DeBrusk, what's the return going to be? Is it a 1-for-1 trade? Is this a package deal? What are we looking at here? Because the power dynamic could go to the Bruins, where Jake DeBrusk is the main piece, and you trade Niels Höglander and blah, 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 Jet Wu, one of those guys, for Jake DeBrusk. Or is it Brock Boeser for Jake DeBrusk and other assets with DeBrusk going to the Canucks? That's going to be something to keep an eye on. I don't know how legitimate this DeBrusk stuff is. It's kind of been really over the past 3 days now that we've been hearing about this. But it's definitely something to look at, because I do see the fit there. But again, the question is, will he sign long-term? He's got 1 year left on his contract. What's the status there? He's obviously not doing well right now in Boston. Do you want to buy a guy at such a low value because he's not that good? Or do the Canucks see themselves as, hey, we have a really good roster, we have a really good organization here, we could turn Jake DeBrusk into that good player? That's some of the questions that Jim Rutherford is going to have to ask. And that's what leads us into the next point on Jim Rutherford. So from Rick Dhaliwal, I do not get the sense there is urgency or pressure for the Canucks to make a big trade. A lot of that is outside noise. Are they taking calls? Yes. Are they doing their due diligence? Yes. Doesn't mean a trade is happening. Again, this is, I think, more the Canucks trying to create leverage in the market, because, again, they don't really have much for the pending contract guys. Even Boeser to an extent. At the end of the day, whether it goes to arbitration or whatever, he still has to sign the damn contract. So I could see still some issues here for the Canucks. Now, with that said, you guys look at the thumbnail of the video. I've got Brock Boeser and JT Miller potentially going to the Minnesota Wild. And the reason I say that is the Minnesota Wild have prospects. They have good draft picks. They've got things that the Canucks could use. And to be honest, both those guys fit what the Wild are looking for. JT Miller, a top 6 center that could fit right in behind what they already have. Behind Joel Eriksson Ek, even maybe he takes the first line minutes. I mean, it's kind of that spot right now until Rossi develops into a top 6 center, and Brock Boeser adds top 6 goal scoring, which the team has been desperately lacking behind Kaprizov and Fiala. So, again, I think there's a lot of just speculation out there, but there's definitely reason to believe the Canucks will be players at this deadline. Like I mentioned, they were tied to maybe Pavel Zacha of the Devils, Jake DeBrusk of the Bruins. I think they're going to be a real player here, and I think they're trying to keep things low-key. But at the end of the day, they are definitely looking around to see what is out there. So guys, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what we're doing here at Goal Line Hockey, want to see the latest news around the NHL, more videos just like this one, you guys know what to do. Make sure to give this video a big thumbs up. Guys, thank you so much, and I will see you again next time.